This is an extended version of a presentation given at the annual Birds New Zealand conference in Thames, New Zealand, in June 2021. It summarizes ground counts and drone surveys of erect-crested penguins on the Bounty Islands. Previous population assessments of the species paint a dire picture. But the infrequency and inconsistency of the surveys these assessments are based upon raise many questions about their validity. In fact, on closer inspection, it is an outright mystery what's up with erect-crested penguin numbers on the subantarctic Bounty Islands. The erect-crested penguin is the least known penguin species. It is one of 4 crested penguin species that live and breed in New Zealand, and it is the largest of the 7 crested penguin species worldwide. Moreover, erect-crested penguins are endemic to the New Zealand region and today only breed on the subantarctic Bounty and Antipodes Islands. Both islands are quite a contrast to another. Whereas the Bounty Islands are little more than a number of barren rocks and rocky islets in the center of the subantarctic ocean with no vegetation or topsoil providing any shelter from the stormy conditions of the roaring 40s, the Antipodes Islands are covered in lush tussock vegetation that offers suitable habitat for diverse bird life, including terrestrial species like endemic parakeets and snipe. The Bounties are principally inhabited only by erect-crested penguins, Salvin's albatross, Fulmar prions in the endemic Bounty Island shag. Yet, both islands are only about 200 kilometers apart from another, which suggests that the marine habitat for seabird populations occupying both islands is indeed comparable. The IUCN Redlist ranks the erect-crested penguin as endangered and has done so since 1996. The species shares this ranking with only 4 other penguin species worldwide, one of which is another New Zealand endemic, the yellow-eyed penguin. Yet, while New Zealand increasingly throws resources at the protection of yellow-eyed penguins, the erect-crested penguin has received next to no research or conservation attention. This may be due to the New Zealand threat ranking listing the species as merely declining, which indeed does not have the same ring to it as endangered. However, what both assessments have in common is that the species is believed to be declining. But how did these assessments reach that conclusion? It all started in 1978 when both islands were visited by subantarctic expeditions that had a broad focus, but also counted albatross and penguins on the side. Or rather counted some of the birds and then extrapolated to obtain a total estimate. But we'll get back to this in a bit. What is odd is that for both islands the estimated numbers of breeding pairs of erect-crested penguins were identical, 115,000 pairs on the Bounties and another 115,000 pairs on the Antipodes. Considering the substantial size differences of both islands, the Bounties have a mere 6% of the land mass of the Antipodes. These numbers seem rather strange. After the 1978 counts, not much happened on the penguin front on either of the 2 islands. The next counts were conducted in 1995 on the Antipodes and in 1997 on the Bounties. The difference between the 70s and 90s surveys were not only that the latter were dedicated counts of penguins, but also that penguin numbers were substantially lower in the 90s. On the Antipodes, the penguin population was only around 52,000 breeding pairs, and on the Bounties, the number apparently had shrunk to just below 28,000 pairs. That corresponded to a decline of 55% on the Antipodes and a whopping 76% on the Bounties, which justifies the endangered ranking on the IUCN Redlist. However, the population sizes in the mid-1990s seem to reflect the different size of the 2 island habitats a bit better than the 1978 estimates. On the Bounties, the year 1997 saw the beginning of a new era of erect-crested penguin counts. Let's call it the Jacinda Amy era, as it was Jacinda that spearheaded and conducted 3 ground counts over the course of 14 years. She focused her counts primarily on Proclamation Island, the most accessible island of the Bounty archipelago. Jacinda established 8 counting blocks on the island, delineated by topographic features and outlined by GPS tracks. The idea was to create a survey template that could be reproduced in the future so that even if only parts of the island could be counted, for example due to time constraints, these counts could be limited to some of the counting blocks and thereby still provide a comparable measure to other surveys. In 1997, 2004 and 2011, Jacinda and her helpers completed full ground counts of Proclamation Island, always conducted in mid-November, close towards the hatching period of erect-crested penguins. And her surveys found little evidence for an ongoing massive decline in penguin numbers, at least on Proclamation Island. In 1997 and 2004, she counted just over 2,700 breeding pairs. In 2011, numbers were lower with only 2,500 breeding pairs present, which represents an 8% decline since 1997. Not good, but nowhere near as bad as the apparent 76% decline between 78 and 97. In October 2019, I had the chance to join an expedition to the Bounty Islands to repeat Jacinda's surveys. We arrived on the 29th of October on the expedition yacht Evoe and spent the next 5 days working with albatross, prions and penguins on Proclamation Island. Landing on this island is truly challenging and requires jumping onto a rock platform from a rubber dinghy that tends to move up and down in the surge like an elevator, followed by a breakneck climb up a sheer granite cliff face where every foothold seems to be occupied by a fur seal. Once at the highest point of the island, we were greeted by a cacophony of seabird calls. Moving on the island is extremely difficult as birds cover almost every inch. Over the 5 days, we carefully walked all over the island, counting every nest and marking it with a blue dab of paint to avoid double counts. We counted 2,876 penguin nests on Proclamation Island, roughly 150 pairs more than during the 97 survey. However, our count was conducted around 3 weeks earlier than the previous surveys, so we had to adjust for the ongoing nest loss. Jacinda had determined this to be around 0.6% of nest loss per day, so that our adjusted count was 2,676 pairs, which is 67 pairs less than in 97. So between 97 and 2019, we only found a 2% decline in numbers, which is well within the range of natural fluctuations. Interestingly, the bad year 2011, when penguin numbers were down by approximately 200 pairs, coincided with a moderate La Niña, which goes along with higher than average sea surface temperatures in the region. This in turn does not agree with the foraging success of penguins, so it seems likely that the missing penguin pairs in 2011 simply decided not to breed because of suboptimal conditions. So the only conclusion we could draw from the data is that erect-crested penguin numbers on Proclamation Island have been stable since 1997. But what about the 1978 numbers, when the bounty population was estimated to be 115,000 pairs? This number translates to just shy of 8,000 breeding pairs on Proclamation Island, which is nearly 3 times the number of pairs in 97. However, while all estimates since 97 were based on full counts on Proclamation Island, the 1978 estimate is based on the difficult to reproduce value of 0.9 penguin nests per square meter, extrapolated over the available landmass considered suitable for the penguins, another rather vague metric. Such an extrapolation also assumes that penguin nests are equally distributed over the islands, but clearly this is not the case. The birds congregate in rock gullies and trenches that offer some protection from the violent storms that rip through the region on a regular basis. More often than not, penguin nests are tucked away in some corner, in every nook and cranny represents prime real estate. To understand how penguins are actually distributed on the island, we used photographic data recorded by a camera drone that was primarily used to survey fur seal distribution, but offered collateral albatross and penguin data. The drone surveyed the island at an altitude of 40 meters and flew predefined grid missions, roughly taking a photo every meter or so, which resulted in a mosaic of nearly 800 high-resolution photos covering the entirety of Proclamation Island. This mosaic could then be stitched together to a massive composite image of the island that allows it to zoom in further and further and further, providing details of the birds occupying the island's surface. Using specialized image annotation software, it was then possible to count each and every bird on the composite image and even distinguish between single birds and pairs. The resulting data point cloud could then be projected onto the island and used to determine the spatial density distribution of penguin nests. It turned out that densities of 0.9 nests per meter, that obscure extrapolation value used in 78, was only achieved in spots that provided maximum shelter from the elements, such as the western slopes of Proclamation Island that are located in the wind shadow of the surrounding islands. Prime real estate indeed. Moreover, nest densities varied greatly, invalidating the extrapolation approach used for the 78 assessment. Could it be that penguin numbers back then were substantially overestimated? As it turned out, the Royal Air Force had performed a flyby on the Bounties in November 1978 and taken an aerial photo of Proclamation Island that provided a clear view of some of the counting blocks. Comparing penguin counts from the aerial photo from 78 and the drone imagery paints a pretty clear picture. There seem to have been a lot fewer penguins on the 78 photos. Of course, the image quality is nowhere near as detailed as the drone composite, but surely if there would have been 3 times as many penguins back in 78, this would still be fairly obvious. So the only logical conclusion is that the 1978 figure represents a substantial overestimate for Proclamation Island, but probably the entire Bounty archipelago. However, does that mean that erect-crested penguins have not undergone population declines? The 78 figures provide a poor benchmark to assess whether penguin numbers may have plummeted in the 20th century, like they did, for example, in rockhopper penguins. But we can look back at historic photos from the Bounties. In 1888, Depot Island, the large island providing Proclamation with shelter from southerly storms, was visited by photographer William Dougal, who took fascinating penguin photos. And on some photos it would appear as if penguin numbers were indeed much higher than the scenes we witnessed 140 years later. However, Dougal visited the island in February, when the penguins start to go through their annual molt, which means that large portions of the population are on land, whereas many penguins were at sea when we conducted our survey. Other images, while looking impressive, seem to be comparable to what we saw on our visit. Are these historic photos an indication for a decline in penguin numbers or not? Well, we can't say, because we haven't visited the sites Dougal photographed, and there is a substantial difference between Dougal's site and our survey site. Our photo, on the right, was taken looking southwest from the eastern end of Proclamation Island, the yellow line indicating the delineation of Proclamation in the foreground and the eastern slope of Depot in the background. Dougal took his photo, on the left, looking northwest on the southern slopes of Depot Island, so on a side that is exposed to the prevailing southerly winds and storms that haunt the subantarctic frequently, and at an ever-increasing frequency thanks to climate change. On sheltered Proclamation Island, we had no idea whether penguin densities on Depot were still comparable to what Dougal documented with his photographs in the late 19th century. In fact, it is imaginable that while penguin numbers are stable on Proclamation, the species may have experienced declines at more exposed sites like the western slopes of Depot. Inspecting density maps of penguin distributions on 4 islands we managed to survey with the drone in 2019 seem to support this possibility. The highest penguin numbers and densities were found on Proclamation and Tunnel Islands, both of which lie neatly sheltered in the wind shadow of Depot. On Spider Island to the north and Ranfurly to the south, there were markedly fewer penguin nests, likely related to the fact that both islands are sitting pretty exposed to the prevailing subantarctic southerlies. Thinking this through brings the sobering realization that, in fact, most other islands in the archipelago, with the exception of the eastern slopes of Depot, are more exposed than Proclamation. Could it be that our surveys on Proclamation do paint an inaccurate picture of erect-crested penguin numbers on the Bounties? Could it be that we focused our survey on an oasis in the desert, assuming that it must be as green outside as it is where we looked? Is the idea of a stable erect-crested penguin population on the Bounties in the end just a mirage? So it is clear that our results, while encouraging at first, do nothing to change the threat ranking of erect-crested penguins. We need a lot more information before we can even think about giving an all clear for the species. Firstly, we must find out how many penguins there actually are on the Bounties. How are the penguins distributed across all the islands and rock stacks? And secondly, we must gain a better understanding how the topography of these islands governs penguin densities. This brings us back to the drone surveys. Because camera drones do not only allow us to conduct a full count of erect-crested penguins and determine nest densities across all islands, the image data also allows us to examine the topography of the Bounties via a process called photogrammetry. The individual images recorded by the drone not only allows the creation of highly detailed composite images. By identifying individual points on a series of images, it is possible to determine each point's position in a 3D space. This in turn allows an accurate reconstruction of the topography of the surveyed islands, as this video clip impressively demonstrates. So to sum it all up, the mystery on the Bounties remains. While we can say that the erect-crested penguin numbers on Proclamation have remained stable probably since the 1970s, we cannot extrapolate this to the rest of the Bounty Islands. That mistake has been made before. Only a full survey of the archipelago will tell us what's up with erect-crested penguin numbers on the Bounties.